So hello and welcome everyone to this webinar organized by the All India Lawyers Association for Justice, ILAJ. It's not a very happy occasion because what we're discussing is something very brutal, something very devastating. Nevertheless, we are very happy to have all of you here. Happy to see that many of us are trying to engage with this very bizarre phenomenon of bulldozer injustice, and we are trying to find a way out of it. So welcome all of you. ILAJ is a pan-India lawyers organization of lawyers and law students, which aims to build a critique of and pose a challenge to the contemporary order, as well as push the boundaries of the law to realize the dreams of an egalitarian world. ILAJ believes that a critical legal constitutional awareness at the mass level is vital to strengthening the constitution and democracy, and is committed to developing the same. ILAJ is also concerned with the welfare of lawyers and law students. You can learn more from our blog and our social media handles, which my colleague Madhulika will share in the chat box. We also bring out the ILAJ e-magazine. Madhulika will share at least the last 2 copies of the e-magazine. The rest you can access from our blog and from our social media handles. Now, today we have met to talk about bulldozer injustice. The Supreme Court, in response to a batch of petitions filed by the Association for the Protection of Civil Rights, APCR, recently came down strongly on the destruction of homes of people accused or convicted of criminal activity. Now, there is a particular kind of demolition, punitive demolition. The SC said that this is not acceptable by any standards and issued an interim order stopping all demolitions without its permission, and pending a set of guidelines by the court. This was on 2nd September. Within a few weeks, a 1,200-year-old dargah, a mosque, a graveyard, and other religious shrines, they were demolished in Somnath in Gujarat in an anti-encroachment drive. Now, importantly, the Supreme Court maintains that its guidelines will not protect unauthorized constructions on public land, and the removal of unauthorized structures will be allowed. This is a good introduction to the kind of situation we are facing, where while we certainly welcome the efforts of the Supreme Court to clamp down on demolitions, several questions and concerns have emerged, which we will discuss today. First of all, there is a need to understand the phenomenon better, because there are multiple kinds of demolitions of working class colonies, of homes of suspected or accused persons, mostly belonging to minorities, punitive domicide having a strong communal color, something which we are calling communal punitive domicide. And also the demolition of religious structures, again belonging to minorities. Many of these demolitions have happened in blatant contravention of existing laws, and with the courts often looking the other way. These have also happened through collusion between local politicians and the police administration, casting some doubts as to how far any guideline can be effective unless backed up by effective sanctions and implemented thoroughly. ILAJ had written to the Supreme Court in August, asking it to take suo motu cognizance of this increasing trend of punitive demolitions. And after the Supreme Court set the ball rolling on the guidelines, we also sent a detailed set of suggestions regarding the guidelines. Both of these you can access from the chat box. Madhulika will share the links with you. In very brief, we have said that first of all, bulldozer justice is a very misleading term. It is commonly used, but it's very misleading because the use of justice here, contrary to its illegality, extends an aura of legitimacy to the action. We instead prefer to use the word homicide, which is the deliberate destruction of home by human agency in pursuit of specific goals, which causes suffering to the victims. And it's clear that the bulldozing of Muslim homes and establishment squarely qualifies as punitive domicide, or even as communal punitive domicide, considering the communal intent behind these punitive actions. In brief, we have requested that the SC must consider this targeting demolition of homes of minorities who have been accused or convicted in a legal matter as communal punitive domicide. It needs to be named and identified. Stop this completely, strictly punish errant officials, and pay adequate reparations to the victims. And importantly, we have demanded that the burden of proving that a demolition is not of a communal punitive nature must lie on the officials and not on the affected parties. At the same time, we have requested the Supreme Court to direct governments to conduct all kinds of demolitions or evictions in accordance with humanitarian principles, natural justice, and existing constitutional and legal provisions. It must act against ongoing illegal evictions of informal settlements in various parts of the country, all of which happen to be going on in the name of encroachment, raising a host of issues about the way dispossession is being used as an instrument to deny substantive citizenship to rural and urban working classes and to minorities. Here we find important parallels with authoritarian states like Israel, where domicide has been an enormous weapon wielded by the Israeli state, the apartheid state of Israel, against Palestinians. This also raises questions on the nature of the deep state that the so-called Hindu Rashtra is creating and the legal and administrative mechanisms which are actually allowing the deep state to operate on the ground. If there is any positive note at all, it is the new forms of resistance which we can witness against this kind of bulldozing, taking the legal route, trying to implement the rule of law, which, as we can see in APR's persistent efforts. We have seen in the demolitions happening, the affected people, particularly the working classes in working class colonies, strongly raising the demand for their right to the city. I remember in Tughlakabad, after the demolitions happened, the strongest response of the people was to the slogan, "Hum Delhi nahi chhodenge," we don't want to leave the city. At the same time, in Bombay, where you find in Jai Bhim Nagar, a very spirited resistance of the Dalit Bahujan women over there who have been evicted, who are raising very important questions about the larger patterns of segregation, of discrimination within urban India and within society on the whole. So today we have with us two speakers who have been at the forefront of resisting the Bulldozer Raj in different ways. Gautam Bhatia, whose work has helped us understand not only the ways and means of the Bulldozer Raj, but also a whole range of constitutional mechanisms which we can see over the last decade, which are being used to subvert the very constitution which it seems to be drawing from. The way in which authoritarianism is functioning, secularism is being ripped apart, the way state repression is drawing legitimacy from existing statutes. All these things are stuff which Gautam has written on, and his writings have been extremely important for us. Afreen Fatima is a researcher at Polis Project. She's also vice president of the fraternity movement. She's been a very important voice of resistance, not only to the Bulldozer Raj. Her home has been demolished in the process, by the way. And she's not only been an important voice against this kind of bulldozing, but generally against the efforts of a particular organization to convert India into a Hindu Rashtra. I'll read just one sentence from something I read about Hindutva's approach towards gender politics and towards Muslim women, just to identify and emphasize the very important role of someone like Afreen Fatima, the role of her voice in enabling us to resist what's going on in the country at the present. The sentence goes, Hindutva's gender politics tries to appear feminist when demanding the criminalization of triple talaq or imposing a uniform civil code, but it cares very little for the lives and aspirations of women, whether Hindu or Muslim. And this is something which we find being exposed repeatedly and very importantly in the voice of Afreen Fatima. So welcome Gautam, welcome Afreen to our webinar. We will now listen to, first we'll listen to Gautam and we will listen to Afreen after that. Both of them will speak for a while and then we will take some questions. Those who want to put in questions or comments even as the speakers are speaking, they can do so in the chat box. And the speakers will get to see your comments and questions, and we will read out your comments and questions in the discussion session after the speakers have spoken. So over to you now, Gautam.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So what I will do is I will lay out some of the constitutional and legal frameworks within which we can try and understand this phenomenon of punitive, religiously targeted demolitions. Of course, the problem is that the officials who carry out these demolitions do not frame it as targeted religious demolitions. They frame it as something else, which is also why it's important to try and just understand the overall legal framework within which this is happening, because much like the euphemism encounter killing, what happens is that there is an attempt to justify these demolitions under the veneer of existing laws and legal procedures. And so the question then is that, how do you engage with that in that legal context? So, of course, a number of demolitions that take place and have taken place in our history have been what you could call gentrification demolitions, which is to say that because the municipal authorities or the state wishes to, develop a particular area, they have to drive out the people who already reside there in informal settlements, in slums, in bastis, and so on. And they do it in this violent manner of forcibly evicting these people, demolishing their homes, and so on. This, of course, was a staple feature first of the British era, and it continued into independence. And of course, the most famous example, or the notorious example, was Sanjay Gandhi during the emergency. So shortly after that, for the first time in the mid 1980s, 1985, the Indian Supreme Court was confronted with a challenge to an attempt to remove street vendors and pavement dwellers from Bombay's pavements in a challenge that was couched in constitutional terms. So the argument was that this removal without notice in the monsoon season violates these individuals' rights to shelter and to livelihood, because that's where the livelihood was based, being relocated to somewhere far outside the city, and so on. And in this judgment called Olga Tellis, a very famous judgment, the Supreme Court analyzed this issue within the constitutional context. Now, unfortunately, there is a very large gap between the general perception of what was done in Olga Tellis and what actually was done in Olga Tellis, and that is at the root of many of the problems that exist today. So the popular perception is that in Olga Tellis, the Supreme Court recognized the right to livelihood and that relocations and evictions, impinge upon the right to livelihood and therefore have to be, justified under constitutional standards and so on. Unfortunately, what actually happened in Olga Tellis was that the people in question were relocated. They were not actually given a stay of execution. It was a brief temporary stay. And the Supreme Court actually said that the procedural obligations that the municipality or the state has at the highest, is just giving due notice. And even that obligation can be waived or done away with if there is urgency. If you need to clear out, a neighborhood, a locality, you don't even need to give notice. You can do it without notice. It's just that in the Supreme Court's normal style, they exhort the executive to do the right thing and that they should give notice. Now, how does that square with, at the same time, the ringing declarations of a right to livelihood of Article 21? Well, that is again the Supreme Court's history. That on the one hand, you spend the first 80% of a judgment in rhetoric, in noble sounding words. When it comes to the actual doctrine and the relief, it is normally, in favor of the state. So, you need to read Olga Tellis in that sense to understand the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. Now, what happens after Olga Tellis for the next, 35 odd years is, broadly, you can see two lines of jurisprudence. Both of which can be reasonably traced back to Olga Tellis. One line, which is the more brutal line, is basically limiting the protections that dwellers of informal settlements or unauthorized constructions have, which is effectively a right to a basic notice. Sometimes right to a hearing, sometimes not, following which there is demolition and evictions. And this is important to understand because this feeds directly back into what's going on today, right? So this line of cases has a very limited protection for people who are facing evictions, on various grounds or demolition and so on. There is another line of cases that does invoke Olga Tellis, but actually is grounded a lot more in contemporary comparative constitutional jurisprudence, in particular the jurisprudence of the South African Constitutional Court. The South African Constitutional Court in the last 20 years, drawing from a very progressive constitution and drawing from a history where the apartheid regime engaged in targeted demolitions and evictions, both as a manner or as a way of redrawing, city boundaries, which of course we are familiar with in the context of laws such as the Disturbed Areas Act, in various states, but also as a punitive measure. So the South African Constitution seeks to address that, and the court over the years has developed this doctrine which it calls a meaningful engagement, which is to say that there has to be a meaningful engagement between the municipal authorities and the people involved, which covers issues like whether it is possible to in situ rehabilitate before evicting someone, whether it is possible to what kind of relocation is being offered, what kind of accommodation is being offered, and the court oversees that process. And crucially, no evictions or demolitions can be done until the meaningful engagement process runs its course to the court satisfaction. Right? That is effectively the doctrine developed in South Africa. It has been followed in other countries, such as Kenya. Other countries in Latin America have their own equivalents of this, and so on. It is basically a part of progressive comparative constitutional law doctrine. So one set of Indian cases, primarily judgments authored by Justice Muralidhar in the Delhi High Court when he was a judge, called Sudama Singh and Ajay Makin, and recent Bombay High Court, set of orders, Justice Gautam Patel, have attempted to take this forward and have attempted, therefore, to compel municipalities to, engage with residents and provide meaningful alternative accommodation, rehabilitation, and even explore the possibility of in situ, rehabilitation before you end up demolishing and evicting people, including those who are so-called encroachers on public land. So, for example, in the Ajay Makin case, the people were living on railway land, right? So that is public land in the classic sense. The problem is twofold. One is that there's, of course, one line of cases. As I said, there's other line that really is limited to just the bare bones of giving notice. And as we know, and as we've seen, notices can be backdated, and they have been in demolitions. So this is one. It's just one line of cases. And secondly, there is no constitutional anchorage that this line of cases has, because when the Indian Constitution was being framed, many of these issues were just not on the table. So unlike other constitutions where you have a right to housing, a right to shelter, and in some constitutions they even regulate evictions in the constitution. In our case, that's not true. And of course, the Supreme Court has claimed to read in those rights into Article 21, but it is, as we know, very fragile, and the court itself keeps going back on that. So that is the problem that we have in actually enforcing these more progressive doctrines that would effectively throw sand in the bulldozer's gears, right? It brings these evictions to a halt, to a stop. It slows them down. The point of punitive demolitions is to send a message, right? So the moment you slow down that process, the moment you say, okay, you can't do it right now, the entire rationale for that spectacular act of demolition just goes away, right? So if you stop that, you effectively deal with the problem. So that is the problem with actually enforcing this line of cases. Now, what has also happened is that in many municipal laws involving specifically slums, they have actually incorporated these more progressive elements in the legislation. So, for example, in the UP Slum Act and some rules, they actually require in situ to be looked at first. They have committees with participation of slum dwellers and so on. But these are limited, and there are exceptions to these, such as slums that are next to rivers, water bodies, and so on. It's always that get out clause that enables the state to evade these laws. So that is broadly the legal and the constitutional framework. And now what happens in this is the final part of what I'm speaking about, is of course in the last 3 or 4 years, what we have seen is what you called punitive demolition, right? Which is that you're not demolishing because you want to develop an area for rich people to come and live in. You're not demolishing because you think that poor people are there illegally. You want to get them out. You're demolishing because you want to send a message. You want to demonstrate your power as the state. You want to target Muslims. And of course, as in the encounter killing framework, you want to deliver state-sponsored vigilante justice, ostensibly in response to previous communal violence in that area. That is effectively what is going on here. Now, of course, what happens then is that when the municipal authorities carry out a punitive demolition, obviously they cannot say what they're doing. They can't say that it is a punitive demolition because that is illegal, and that would lead to litigation, that would lead to very obvious consequences. So what they say is that we are just demolishing these buildings because they are irregular and illegal. And then they take advantage of the more regressive line of Supreme Court cases and the gaps in the statutory framework in the municipal laws to say we have complied with all the requirements. And what are those requirements? Will just be basically giving a notice. They don't do that sometimes. They backdate. We've seen that in demolitions. But they basically say, look, our only obligation under the Constitution, under legislation, under the municipal laws is we had to give you notice. We gave you notice, and then we are now at liberty to demolish your home. And that is where the problem of the inadequacy of the Indian constitutional text as well as jurisprudence comes in. That's one issue. The second, of course, is that even as the authorities are invoking the justification of legislation and law, the politicians are not, because they have to play to their constituents, to their base. So they will very obviously say that this is, of course, we're taking revenge, and so on. That Bulldozer, Baba, all of that, right? So they obviously dog whistle to their base to demonstrate that they are powerful politicians who are taking, who are engaging in justice outside the slow-moving formal justice system. Right? So then what do you do? Now, what you would think would be that the very obvious thing to do is to go to the court and say, look, here is evidence that shows the motivations behind what is happening. Right? And there you run up into another problem, which is administrative law in general does not allow the court to take into account these kinds of statements, right? So the court is not allowed, or at least is discouraged under legal doctrine, to impugn the motivations of state officials. And in this case, because the politicians are not doing the demolitions, because it is the authorities that are doing it, and you are, again, in law, you are supposed to draw a distinction between the politician and the statutory authority who has the power to do this. Of course, in real life, that's not the case. Therefore, all the court can look at is is there any evidence that the municipal authorities were motivated explicitly by communal concerns? And there you don't find it, because effectively, like we've seen, the state is acting in a two-faced manner, right? So the politicians who don't have the formal power to demolish are, saying the quiet part out loud, whereas the municipality, which does have the demolition power and is the responsible body, is invoking the law to safeguard, what it's doing. Right? So then, what do you do? So here again, jurisprudence from other countries can potentially help. And for instance, in Latin American countries, there is a very famous doctrine called the unconstitutional state of affairs, which is basically meant to address exactly this kind of behavior, where if you look at one demolition, in one area, the authority has said, okay, irregular construction, that's why we did it. So you can't really do much over there as the court. You look at the second demolition in an isolated way, same thing. But when you have across the country over 2 years, 40 demolitions, each of which have come after a communal incident, in most of which there is an overwhelming targeting of Muslims, clearly a pattern emerges of what is going on, which does not require you to look at an individual instance and focus on an individual statement. And Latin American courts in this context have developed this doctrine to say, okay, we as the court can take cognizance of the fact that across the country, there is an unconstitutional state of affairs where the state has systematically failed to protect rights, and in fact, is systematically complicit in the rights violations. And then you have remedies that accordingly address the issue structurally. That is a possibility. So far, the Supreme Court of India has not been keen to go down that road, and even where it acknowledged the existence of punitive demolitions in last month, which we just mentioned in the beginning, it did not acknowledge the religious and targeted character of these demolitions. B, it promised to pass guidelines, which we've all worked on them for different parties. But again, the problem with guidelines is twofold. One is that they are forward-looking. Right? So what happens to all the previous people who were targeted and the house was demolished? And secondly, it fundamentally fails to address the systematic nature of this. Right. So what will then happen is that somebody will demolish this someone's house, and then the person who owns the house is then go to court and say, okay, your previous guideline has been now violated, now take action, right? So this sort of thing doesn't really protect people in that way. Of course, we hope that the guidelines that are framed, and we can discuss that more in the Q&A, are actually effective. But the Supreme Court's framing of this issue as one that requires guidelines to regulate is in itself a problem, because when you have targeted illegal demolitions, you don't regulate them, you get rid of them, you stop them, right? And the court has so far not acknowledged the real problem. Until the court does that, any remedy will be partial at best. So I will stop there and happy to discuss more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Gautam. Before we listen to Afreen, just a small anecdote I'd like to share from Delhi, just to enforce this point about the exact mechanism by which it is happening. It's so systematic and so planned. In Mehrauli, sometime last year, an 800-year-old dargah was demolished and a madrasa, on the pretext that it had encroached on a forest area called Sanjay Van. Now, Sanjay Van happens to be a designated forest just 25 years ago, and the dargah some 800 years ago. Now, on top of that, what happened was, just to justify that it wasn't just Muslims who they were targeting, they also demolished a small temple belonging to a local Dalit community at the same time. And they actually brought some of the local Muslims to that temple and said that, "Dekho, we don't spare temples either." And when I spoke to the pujari of the temple, he's a new pujari. He's someone who's part of the new network of pujaris who are now being sponsored by the government. He was very confident. I asked him that, what next? He said, "Mandir wahi banega. We'll have a new temple again." So that's how deep rooted and systematic it's really become. On that note, I think Afreen is a far better person to tell us about the systematic nature of this and how dangerous it's become to live in places where we have this kind of a system in place, this kind of a nexus between politicians and the police and the administration, and more. Afreen, welcome, and you can tell us whatever you want to share with us.
Hello. Hi, am I audible fine?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. I'm very thankful for all of you to join. I'm especially thankful to Elaj for organizing this talk, especially going into the details of how much can we celebrate the guidelines that the Supreme Court might issue. Before I start speaking on the notes that I've made, I would like to stand in solidarity with people's resistance in Palestine, in Lebanon, in India, and everywhere else against occupation. And so to start, I just want to talk about a few details about the demolition of my own home, because I think that brings into perspective the impunitive the impunity of law enforcement, the impunity of district administration, and how it works in tandem with the Hindutva regime. So when my own home was being demolished on 11th of June, uh, at around 10 p.m., the police pastes a notice on the gate of our house with when there was not a single member of the family present. Three of the members who were the primary residents, my father, my mother, and my younger sister, were detained. Subsequently, my father was made into a mastermind, and then hence the demolition was justified. This notice that was pasted read that the date on it was 10th of June. Though it was pasted, it was never handed to us. And it was addressed to my father, who is not the legal owner of the property that was illegal. So it makes a very clear case that if my home was being demolished simply because it was an illegal construction, or it was an encroachment, or whatever problems that the district, the Prayagraj Development Authority, the PDA had, how come they did not even know who was the legal owner of the house? How come they did not even know who was paying the water tax, who was paying the electricity bills? And they never addressed the notice to my mother, who is the legal owner of the house. So that is one aspect of the impunity, that you want to punish Javed Muhammad for allegedly organizing a protest. And that is why you issue a notice to him. That is the only sense of issuing the notice to my father, because the property is not his to begin with. The other thing is that when my mother, my father, and my younger sister were held in detention, I and my sister-in-law were present at the house initially for some time, and the police presence started increasing outside of our house. Around 2 a.m. on 11th of June, they started intimidating us to accompany them to the police station. When we refused, they said that no, you have to come. They were the way the police is. But then one woman police officer comes to us and says, आप समझ नहीं रही हैं, आपका घर मार्क कर दिया गया है, आप अपने किसी रिलेटिव के घर चली जाइए. You're not understanding, your house has been marked. You go to a relative's place, we just want the house empty. And this is on 11th of June. This is on 10th of the intervening night of 10th and 11th of June. That also clearly says that they already had the intention of demolishing our home even before the notice was even pasted. We have filed the petition in the Allahabad High Court, but to this day, we have not had a single hearing except for the mandatory counter and rejoinder. There's not a single hearing that has happened. So in the context of this, I'll start talking about demolitions, about extrajudicial and punitive demolitions. So these are not just acts of destruction, but they serve a wider political and social function intended to punish an entire community. What we are witnessing, how the machinery of the state, in tandem with the Hindutva ideology, with Hindu supremacy, is systematically using demolitions to assert dominance, to instill fear, and perhaps most dangerously, to normalize violence against Muslims. Recent discussions about the Supreme Court issuing guidelines against demolitions do offer some hope. I'm not very hopeless, but there is a precedence, there is history that has shown that existence of the mere existence of guidelines does not guarantee their enforcement. I've said, I think, written about this before also, that the Tehseen Poonawalla case, where the Supreme Court issued directives to curb mob violence, were never properly enforced. And we see how mob violence translates even today, with every day Muslims being lynched, Muslims being harassed, uh, and Muslims being made victim of mob violence. And the police does not even register an FIR under relevant sections, earlier of the IPC and now of the BNS, despite there being a section, there being sections for hate crimes. Um, so the effectiveness of any legal or judicial intervention is wholly dependent on its enforcement. Even in cases where the courts have ordered halting of the demolitions, for example, the Jahangirpuri demolitions, for example, what we saw in New, we have seen that uh, there is little impact of these decisions on the ground. BJP leaders, the state governments openly continue with the demolition, and only when there is it takes a lot on part of the Supreme Court or the High Courts to go out of their way to just issuing an order does not really help. And despite the Supreme Court recently halting all demolitions except for certain public properties, uh, we have seen BJP leaders openly state that bulldozers will not stop. And there have been demolitions even after the Supreme Court's order. So the bulldozer has become more than just a tool of demolition. It is now a symbol of power, representation it's a representation of state-backed impunity, with BJP politicians and Hindutva groups using it as a badge of honor, like Gautam sir also said. The nexus between BJP, state-led governments, and the police has created a situation where legal norms are routinely flouted. There is no law in India that allows for demolition of homes even when a person is convicted. And even the Supreme Court has recently said this. Uh, but let alone when they are merely accused or linked to a protest, demolitions are happening. District magistrates, DMs, SSPs oversee these demolitions, citing vague reasons such as illegal construction, encroachment. Uh, this is nothing short of legal smokescreen for collective punishment. And the problem runs deeper than just abuse of power by state officials. The demolitions are carried out with a specific aim to teach Muslims a lesson. They serve as a spectacle, a public punishment designed not only to physically remove Muslims from certain spaces, but also to send a message to the broader Muslim community that dissent will not be tolerated. And this punishment is not only directed at Muslims, it also has a message for the Hindu majority. The demolitions reinforce the idea that Muslims are second class citizens whose homes, livelihoods, security are all dependent on their compliance with the state and the societal order that is increasingly hostile and violent towards them. One has to realize that the celebration that follow these demolitions, where Hindutva groups, even members of the Hindu population community, rejoice in the destruction of Muslim homes, like we saw in MP. It reveals the deep-rooted Islamophobia that now pervades a large section of the Indian society. So this is not just state violence. It is violence that is endorsed, encouraged, and celebrated by the society at large. The idea of the bulldozer as a metaphor for the Hindutva's vision of a new India is terrifying. It signals that the destruction of Muslim lives and properties is not an aberration but a feature of the political landscape. The hate that fuels these demolitions is both structural and societal. Structurally, the state, especially BJP ruled areas, has adopted punitive measures like demolitions uh, as a means of disciplining the Muslim community. And these actions are justified under the pretense of upholding law and order, but in reality, they violate the very laws that they claim to enforce. And societally, normalization of hate against Muslims, amplified by, excuse me, by Hindutva groups and large sections of the media, ensures that this violence is not only accepted but also celebrated. But why does this celebration happen? Why do people rejoice when a family's home is destroyed? It is because the violence is framed as a necessary for the survival of the Hindu India. Muslims are portrayed as internal enemies whose mere existence poses a threat to the nation. The bulldozer then becomes a tool of not just destruction but of purification, cleansing the nation of its undesirable elements. And this is a dangerous narrative, one that has uh, deep historical echoes in other genocides and acts of ethnic cleansing. The biggest hurdle to stopping these demolitions is the culture of impunity that has taken root within India's law enforcement agencies. Police and local officials operate with full knowledge that they will face no consequence of their actions. And when BJP leaders openly defy court orders, as we have seen, this impunity is only reinforced. What are Supreme Court guidelines if the very apparatus meant to enforce them is part of the problem? Without accountability, without checks on the power of law enforcement and political leaders, these demolitions will continue, and any guidelines, no matter how well intentioned, will be ignored. So, what can be done? Firstly, there must be reparations. Those whose homes have been destroyed, whose lives have been upended, deserve not only compensation but also justice. The state must be held accountable, both financially and legally. DMs, district magistrates, police officers, political leaders who oversee and encourage these demolitions must face legal consequences. Secondly, there needs to be a broader societal reckoning. The hate that fuels these demolitions does not exist in isolation. It's part of the larger Hindutva project that seeks to reshape India into a Hindu Rashtra. So to challenge the demolitions, we must also challenge the narratives that justify them. Muslims are not the other. We are not the enemies of the state. We are citizens who have the right to exist, to protest, and to live with dignity. The battle against demolitions is not just a legal one, it is a fight for social justice to prevail. We must resist not only the physical destruction of Muslims' homes, but the ideological project that underpins it. Only by addressing both the structural and the societal roots of this violence can we hope to create an India, a society where homes are places of safety and not targets of state sponsored violence and terror. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afreen. It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. We not only stand in solidarity with you, but we also draw a lot of strength from you. And absolutely, I mean, bulldozer as the metaphor of the Hindu Rashtra, that's really the perfect articulation, I feel. I think Afreen has drawn our attention to a very important dimension of the problem, that on the one hand, we tend to connect the question of bulldozers to historic rights regarding housing, spatial rights of the working classes, But here we have a completely different dimension, which is emerging very strongly now. The wider patterns of discrimination, dispossession and segregation of Muslims. This mark, कि आपके घर को मार्क कर दिया गया है, जिस तरह से घरों को मार्क किया जा रहा है यूपी में, in Uttarakhand, this talk of shops revealing the names of the owners is clearly a wider pattern. And not to forget Assam. Assam doesn't come so much in the news. And here I'm actually quoting Himanta Biswa Sarma because he said this in a very different sense, that Assam doesn't come so much on the news, but you should be happy to know that we have bulldozed 500 homes. You know, so that's the problem there. So the Assam story needs to come in, I think, very strongly when it comes to this kind of targeting of Muslims that we are seeing. Also, Afreen's points draw attention to, you know, the, what let's call it, for the lack of a better term, the subsidiary ecosystems of Hindutva, which are locally very dense, which are locally very strong, which may exist in certain pockets like Nu and Mewat in Haryana, where you have an enormous ecosystem developing of the cow vigilantes and so many lynchings happening across the belt. It doesn't necessarily exist elsewhere. These are very dense, localized ecosystems, but which are extremely powerful and which are playing an important role in, you know, in conveying this sense of terror to Muslims and to the wider population, the Hindu and other communities in the country, the Adivasis, the Dalits, that Muslims are second-class citizens and they should be treated as such. I have a few comments and questions, but I'll reserve them for the end. For now, we are now open to discussion. So whoever in the audience wishes to ask a question or to make a comment, you can type it in the chat box. If you wish to speak, you can also raise your hand and we can do that. I think
we haven't received any questions in the chat box yet, Akash. So
okay,
we can wait for a few minutes.
We can wait for a few minutes. I think it's the overwhelming nature of the topic, and you know what we are hearing is leaving people wondering what to ask, what to say. As we wait for, Abha Muralitharan has a question for Gautam. Could you please type it, Abha? As Abha sends a question, let me add something. You know, I think very important what Afreen has just pointed out, that right now there's a need to really bring this whole question of punitive demolitions and bulldozer injustice into a wider societal consciousness. This problem exists with regard to all demolitions. There is a certain social connotation of illegality. I'll give an example. In Delhi, the DDA, the Delhi Development Authority, recently designed an app in which you as a resident can register and say that next to my home there is a colony which seems illegal and it should be demolished. Just kind of setting citizens against each other. So while there has been a larger kind of societal consciousness against what the state passes off as encroachments, there's a dimension of that with regard to properties of Muslims. And the need for us to really make it an issue in the way, in the past few years with regard to other issues, we've been able to raise them to a level of mass consciousness. I think CA, NRC being a good example about which not many people knew initially. But the people's movements and various groups, we came together and we brought it into the public sphere very strongly. This question of bulldozer injustice, I think, also needs to be done in that way. We have Abha's question. Abha wants to ask about the BNSS, Bharatiya Nagarik Suraksha Sanhita, if and how 19th century European laws had anything to do with the discourse of encroachment and demolitions. This is to try and make sense of the timing of the laws that have now come in the form of reform of the criminal laws. That's the question from Abha.
No, I mean the origins. The origins of this kind of discourse obviously goes back much further. It goes back to the enclosure of the commons, in 17th century England, when with the beginning of industrial capitalism, you start to wall off what was previously the commons, in the context in which this idea of the encroacher, actually really comes into being, and that's the whole that exported to the colonial context. And there's a lot of good literature on that. We can discuss that afterwards. But yeah, I mean, the roots of it go much deeper. And once you adopt a capitalist property owning structure, which we have kept at independence, then obviously this will follow, because what follows from the right to hold property is the right to exclude everybody else from accessing that property except on your terms, subject to, of course, a set of narrow exceptions. So that is an accompaniment of just this political economy that we've chosen to be in, and therefore this issue of demolitions and evictions that have to do with land use and disputes over land is something you see across the board. You see it in South Africa, in Kenya, and Latin American countries, across the board. So that's not something that is unique to us. What is unique to us is what we understand to be targeted, punitive demolitions aimed at Muslims with a view to demonstrating a certain kind of majoritarian power at the intersection of the state and government and the bureaucracy. Now, of course, even that has precedent in other countries. So the targeted demolitions of anti-apartheid activists, of the Mau Mau in Kenya, So yeah, so you have. I mean, this is an old playbook. It's taken a very specific form, in India at the present moment, but its roots are deeper, and yeah, they go back much further. So I think, yeah, I mean, to answer the question, I don't think BNSS specifically has anything to do with this. I think this is just a much older and much more vicious thing that we're dealing with.
We have several questions regarding what to expect from the government, what should be done, analysis. I'll read out one question from Aishwarya. Israel is known to share a lot of its strategies, military and other repressive tactics with other countries. They train other countries. They train other countries, law enforcement, and even armies. Some say that George Floyd's murder was a tactic frequently used by Israel. Demolitions is something we've seen in the West Bank and Gaza too. Can the speakers draw a link between these two? Yeah, Gautam, Afreen, I mean, whoever wants to go first.
I'll just defer to Afreen on this.
Afreen, are you there with us? Yeah.
Sorry. I got no, yeah. So I think when it comes to Israel and its demolitions, especially in the West Bank, I would, especially at this point of time, I would not want to compare the situation in India with what's happening in Palestine, but same playbook, and is Israel has been able to sort of post 2014 get in a really close connection with the Indian government, especially because of the ethnically superior nature of Hindutva and Zionism. So that's where, like, I think it stems from that the BJP takes lessons from the Zionist movement and sort of tries to replicate its violence in India as well.
Before we move on to discussing our response and what is to be done, Clifton wants to make some remarks. Advocate Clifton de Rosario is also the Secretary of ILAJ.
Just mute this. Actually, thank you, Gautam, Afreen. I just want to make one comment, and I think Gautam, when you started off, and you talked about the nature of demolitions. I think demolitions are not new in this country, and if you like you, Pedro, if you look at the urban context, the way in which city beautification, so on and so forth, have always been a ruse to throw the urban poor out of the city. Similarly, you have in rural areas, even now as we speak, in Bihar, for instance, where the houses of poor Dalits, other backward communities, whose homes are being demolished again in the name that they are encroachments. And this is something that you also find in Adivasi areas as well. That you are encroachers on the land. So it's not just their on the forests. So it's not just their homes. Their entire cultivations are taken away from them. So this thing of dispossession and demolitions as a tool of subjugation, I think that's something that all of us know, and we of course now have a different kind of development of that in the form of these punitive demolitions. So I would think that that's the kind of trajectory that we see. But I also just wanted to thank you, Gautam, also because I think this point of of Olga Tellis onwards and this dearth of jurisprudence in terms of protecting this right to shelter, right to livelihood, that is something that's so obvious and telling at this point. So, for instance, there is no act to protect the homes of slum dwellers across India. You have certain state-specific legislations, but more often than not, they're very, very shoddy in their implementation and weak in terms of how they're formulated. So yeah, I think for us, one of the reasons we wanted to do this is also to bring this dialogue out. I think the questions on regard to the guidelines you all will definitely answer. But I think this larger trajectory of demolitions of subjugation, that is something that all of us are really concerned of.
Yeah, and just to like sort of briefly respond to that, I think that much like a lot of other issues, if you see countries where there is judicial pushback and doctrines developed, it's a situation where there is a social consensus developed over time that this is something that is wrong. Right? It's on the back of that that you have constitutional rights being effective and the court having the power to intervene. One major issue I think that we have is that the way that demolitions are couched is very similar to the way encounter killings are couched. And since you have this long history of this discourse where because the judicial system is so slow and ineffective, what do you do but take matters into your own hands? And if the state does that on your behalf, that is bringing you as the society a kind of catharsis, because the state is taking revenge for you or delivering justice for you, and the same logic then is deployed to justify bulldozer action. So I think that there are multiple fronts on which this has to actually be engaged with if we are to move forward on developing first a social consensus that this is wrong, and then the legal and the constitutional thing will follow. But we can't expect the legal and the constitutional, enforcement to come before we actually manage to do this, because then that never works.
Thank you both, Advocate Clifton de Rosario and Gautam. Now, there are a whole range of suggestions that have come in terms of what needs to be done. I'll read them out one by one, and both our panelists could respond to them. First, from Firasha, can we look into bringing in a law against demolitions in Parliament, hypothetically? Would that work? Can we also look into legalization of so-called illegal informal housing as a means of protection? Is that a feasible strategy? Gautam, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so this depends a lot on what the law says. So I think in the abstract, it's a little difficult to I guess answer that, because would the law recognize for example, aggravated communally targeted demolitions, right? Like, and if so, how would it define that? We once had this communal violence bill, right? And then I think it was the last thing that was introduced in Parliament, UPA 2, and finally didn't come. So I think like if you're not going to, if the law will not confront and address the problem of communal targeted demolitions, then it's not going to be of much use. So that's one thing. And regularization, yeah, but that's the problem, right? So the problem is that when the municipality demolishes something, they don't say that we are doing it because we are doing it because yesterday there was a communal incident here, and because like so much of Indian construction is formally irregular for reasons that we all know. Again, you have to see, okay, what are you regularizing? Like what are the methods of doing that? Because if there is something that's left out of that, and inevitably what will happen will be that people, so as in fact as Supreme Court order itself says, you will have all these exceptions, right? So encroachments on X, Y, Z, and ultimately what you will find is that the people who fall through the cracks are those who are most vulnerable already, right? So again, how will that then address their issues? I think, yeah, I mean, in principle, yes, but I think this is entirely dependent on the details.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this, Afreen?
Yeah, I think agreeing to everything Gautam sir said, in terms of there being a bill or there being a law against demolitions, again, it's as like, it's as beautiful as the guidelines look. The question that I really ask myself, and I want everyone to ask, is how will we enforce this law? How will we enforce the guidelines? Because one has to understand that there is deep-seated biases within the Indian law enforcement against marginalized communities, especially the Muslim community. So I'm not sure, like, even when it comes to like, in terror cases, how Muslims are mostly uh, uh, criminalized. Umar Khalidi's work on the impunity of the law enforcement and his research into it is a stark example of that if the people who are supposed to enforce this law or these guidelines are themselves biased against and we fall on the law enforcement. There needs to be a check on the impunity that they enjoy, especially because of the political power that's backing them. That's one. And I think in terms of regularization of, I mean, I do wish that the guidelines would have that if the government can regularize a property, it should. And I think even in most of state laws relating to demolitions, uh, the priority has to be towards regularization and not demolition. But then that never really happens. The priority is always demolition, because for example, in my case, there are 500 houses built in this locality and only one was demolished, right? So our house could have been easily regularized if it was really illegal.
Right. Yeah, just to add a bit on this, someone like Gautam Bhan or Sushmita Pati, they have argued that a lot of the irregularities we have is actually planned, because it's part of the way the cities are planned and the way towns are planned. That a large number of people are going to fall through the cracks. It's part of the plan in a way. And, for instance, a lot of the colonies which are declared as illegal, there's also a question on what basis does the state decide? Because a lot of these colonies are settled because the politicians and the local police, they together want a set of laborers or workers to stay and work on a particular project. And in the process, there are electricity bills, there are voter ID cards issued on that address. So for the state to then come and say that despite a voter ID card being issued on that address, your home is illegal, there's a problem there. There's a problem in the way the whole question of spatial legality and illegality is being debated within the law and the constitution of our country. But the suggestion on a bill is something that around which we might be able to think of some things. How do we actually regularize this? As Gautam said, and Afreen also agreed, that the devil lies in the details. Now, just to add a few more points here, there are a lot of questions have come up from various perspectives asking what we need to do. I'll put them together. Aishwarya has asked that what is the work ahead of us so that we can change the very framing of this from punitive action to illegal state action. That when we say punitive demolitions, perhaps still we are somewhere down the line thinking of it as a form of legitimate action against crime and not calling out the sheer illegality as strongly as we should. That's from Aishwarya. Lekha has asked, very similar treatment is meted out to, say, Dalits in parts of Bihar, and where this is told to them that we are teaching a lesson to you by destroying your homes. Brahminical supremacy has tried to ensure second-class citizenship for the oppressed classes. So what do we expect from the SC's guidelines or from any particular law that we would want in this historical context of caste oppression, in addition to the oppression on minorities? Bhatia has asked, how do we actually respond to this rhetoric that extralegal violence is both necessary and justifiable? There's so much social legitimacy for various kinds of extralegal violence that these kind of demolitions also tend to fall within it. And one needs to kind of build an argument against that. How do we do that? Yeah, there are a few other suggestions that, demolitions need to be penalized and sanctions need to be imposed, so on. But these are the three set of questions to which maybe we could respond now. Just to repeat, demolition of homes of Dalits, what can we expect with regard to that? Can we call it even communal punitive domicide, or we need to call out the illegality of it more strongly? And third, how do we build a narrative against any form of extralegal and extrajudicial use of violence against anyone in society? Your thoughts on that, Gautam and Afreen? Afreen, would you like to go first this time? You don't have to respond to everything, just whatever you feel like you can, share on these.
Just gathering my thoughts. Yeah, so in terms of, I think, demolitions being extrajudicial in nature, I think the thing is that almost all demolitions in India are extrajudicial in nature. There is some part of the due process that is not followed, and even in removal of encroachments, or even in the so-called demolitions that we don't really consider as being punitive in nature or being extrajudicial in nature, or it's just the district administration, or sorry, just the development authorities doing their job, beautifying, for example, the Kukarel Riverfront project in Lucknow, this massive project of Yogi Adityanath. So these demolitions do seem like they're judicially I think the Akbar Nagar demolitions were judicially sanctioned, but at the same time, one also has to question these judicially sanctioned demolitions also. One has to sort of advocate for colonies that have been there, houses that have been there for 30-40 years, and then all of a sudden the state government decides to build a beautification project, and these people are rendered homeless all of a sudden. And the court would the court agrees to it, and then we think that that's it. Okay, the court has said that it's okay to demolish these properties, and we should be okay with it. That is something that deeply irks me, because it just says that we are okay with the weak's home being demolished. We are okay with the marginalized homes being demolished. It's only when big structures, like we saw recently in Chhatarpur MP, or like we saw when my home was demolished. It's only when big structures come down that we, like, it irks us, or it hits our conscience that this is something that should not happen. Even a one room small juggi should not be demolished. And so the whole idea of only speaking out against demolitions when they're extrajudicial, uh, almost all, from what I've been researching, almost all cases of demolitions are extrajudicial. There is a, if actually you go by the law, the Supreme Court does not really have to issue guidelines, because there are provisions, there are resettlement, or compensation, or rehabilitation, and identifying other places for the communities that are being that would be displaced now, issuing notices, giving a period of almost 1 month in most cases, at least in MP and UP. There's the notice has to stay there. The notice has to give a time of 1 month for the aggrieved party to be able to respond to it. None of these are followed. So if in UP itself, if only the Uttar Pradesh Urban Planning Act is followed, and the due process is followed, most of the demolitions, especially the punitive demolitions, would not come through, because the people will challenge it in court, and then the court will hold that, okay, it's not going to happen. I'm not sure. I think I've lost what the question
No,
was.
yeah, that's fine. We've got your point. Gautam, any additions?
Yeah, I think I agree that we shouldn't be talking about this in terms of judicial and extrajudicial, because many of the most brutal demolitions are sanctioned by the court. So Akbar Nagar, Kukrel, I was in that case for one set of petitioners, and yeah, and it was the court was well, the court sanctioned demolition after, so the single judge in the Allahabad High Court that first put a stop to it. Then they took the case away from him and sent it to a division bench that then authorized it. And he went to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court's completely unwilling to hear anything. I mean, the moment that there is said it's by a river, it's like they stop listening, and all that jurisprudence and doctrine, all that doesn't matter. So it's what is operating is pure prejudice, in the court. So I think in that sense, yeah, judicial extrajudicial is perhaps it blurs what the problem is, which is that when it comes to demolitions, the various arms of the state are pretty much at idem, and in fact often you see the court being much more inhumane than the executive and the legislature, because actually the latter two are answerable in some way to people, and you can't be too brutal without a certain kind of backlash, because the court is insulated from that. Ultimately you actually see often in fact, many times what we've seen is that the executive uses the court shoulder to fire from. So if you don't want to do something because it'll be backlash, you get the court to order it, and then you can get it done. And I think that also explains why even in this guidelines order, which is perhaps the first acknowledgement that you have of some kind of problem existing, in the last 3 years of these targeted demolitions, it's still basically, I mean, the court's order itself, is has this idea of there being the correct kind of demolition and the incorrect kind of demolition. And yeah, we need to have doctrine that will prevent the wrong kind of demolition, but also allow the state to go to the right kind. The right kind is ultimately a class-based thing, right? It ultimately goes down to it's much easier for the court to sanction demolitions where the people being evicted are those who belong to the class that is not the class of the judges, right? So I think that you need to shift the frame. It shouldn't be about judicial extrajudicial, which also brings me to the final question, which was, how does it frame shift? And I think it's very hard, and from what I've seen and from what I've studied, it appears to me that the only times where it's been successful, has been where effectively, these demolitions or these evictions have basically become indiscriminate, right? To a point where no one, is safe from them. One part of the reason why, Indira Gandhi lost after the emergency was in many ways the indiscriminate character of what she was doing. And so until you can actually tell yourself the people being targeted are the others, and I don't belong to that group, so I'm safe, you will support that. When it begins to look like it's indiscriminate, that's when you will start to have doubts. And so again, so one reason, for example, why there was, and this is just a parallel example, but why in South Africa after apartheid they were able to abolish death penalty was because it had become so clearly an abusive tool used by the apartheid regime against all black people that there was a consensus for removing it. So I think like and this might, I think this is a little perhaps depressing because it indicates that until things get worse, they can't get better. But from what I've seen, the only way to develop social consensus, against something like encounters, against something like demolitions, is if everyone is afraid, and that's when the wrongness of it begins to hit home, yeah. But
Yes,
until then, Until then, you have to keep trying, using language of universal rights, using language of due process. Keep trying and trying to chip away at it. But yeah, that's something we have to obviously keep doing.
Thank you. Last couple of messages and then we shall close. One from Kalpana. Thanks to ILAJ for organizing this. And she says that she is with South Asia Solidarity Group, which is a London-based group. And the group, along with other organizations, they are launching a campaign against JCB, which, as many people know, is a British company. They are focusing on the use of their machines in domicide and ethnic cleansing in both India and Palestine, and seeking to hold them accountable. Do you have any suggestions for these specific demands from JCB which need to be put forward in the Indian context? Thank you, Kalpana. We will get back to you on that from ILAJ, and we will frame some suggestions in consultation with Gautam and Afreen. Malini has put in a very important question. She's asked, my question has to do with the weakening of grassroots movements that have historically opposed demolitions in India. For instance, in the mid-late 2000s, Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao Andolan in Mumbai was a good example, led by Simpreet, Medha, and many slum leaders. They were very vocal about against policies on encroachment removal, illegal properties, etc. Today, would you say that such movements are relatively weaker? Is this because of UAPA and other laws that criminalize dissent? Or is this the sad truth that because today there is a communal character to demolitions, the Hindu majority population is not standing by Muslims? Would Gautam or Afreen would like to reflect on that? Why exactly we are not able to build grassroots movements against this? Any thoughts? There's a very pointed question. Is it because Hindus don't care because it seems that the attack is primarily on Muslims? I think Afreen has already reflected on that to a great extent in course of a presentation. That there is definitely Islamophobia is a very big dimension to this. But if I may add, perhaps it is not just that. When it comes to bulldozing, see, in public consciousness, there isn't necessarily a great differentiation between bulldozing of homes of Muslims and bulldozing of illegal working class colonies. The shared conception is of that these are all illegal people, and if Muslims are also illegal, great, their homes should be demolished. So there is a class dimension also to this apathy as much as the religious dimension. I would say both of them are pretty strong. And in fact, yes, certainly the clampdown on dissent has played a role. Just to give you a couple of examples, on a couple of occasions, me and some friends were detained in Delhi, and we very narrowly escaped some greater sanction because we were opposing the opposing demolitions in a couple of places. It was just said that you're opposing a court order, like Gautam said, that a lot of times, when the politicians can't do it, when the administration can't do it, they get orders from the court. And we were told you're opposing orders from the court, and we will arrest you and we will impose all sorts of cases on you. And I remember on one such occasion in the police station, I was observing the way the policemen were talking to each other. The language of the policemen, the sheer disgust in class terms towards the people whose homes were being demolished was quite something to take note of. So I suppose there is both. There is a class apathy as well as a religious apathy. And definitely, as Afreen has pointed out, as Gautam has also suggested, that there is a need to link up this whole question of bulldozer injustice, not only with the kind of trade union work we link up with, but also with the campaigns, whatever campaigns we are able to launch against Islamophobia, against the specific targeting of Muslims, against the reduction, the attempted reduction of Muslims to second-class citizens in all forms and measures. And while agreeing with Afreen that we shouldn't draw comparisons with India and Israel as yet, I hope we do not have to. But unfortunately, the Indian state is trying to copy Israel as much as possible. And this goes back to the late 90s, the early 90s, when insurgency began in Kashmir. And the Indian state framed the Kashmir problem as similar to the Palestine problem. So if we do not want to reach that point, I think we need to be very proactive and rebuild. See, Malini, I think in the introduction, I mentioned that if there's anything positive to take at all from this, it is the rebirth of a lot of grassroots movements against this kind of brutal bulldozer Raj that we are seeing. We can see that in Mumbai, we've been seeing it in Delhi, we've been seeing it from civil society organizations. I'll give the last word to Afreen and Gautam, but from my side, if I may conclude with a couple of points of my own, that as one of the commentators has pointed out, one of the keys definitely lies in making this one of the core agendas of the political opposition. There is only so far that even the judiciary can do unless we are able to make it a core agenda of the entire political discourse. When we're talking about saving democracy, we're talking about rebuilding democracy, ending bulldozer Raj in all its shapes and forms, vis-a-vis Islamophobia as well as vis-a-vis oppression on workers and Dalits. This needs to be a core political agenda. That is perhaps one of the ways in which we might be able to move a bit faster than we are moving right now. Last word to Afreen and Gautam. If you would like to add anything, then please do, and we will close after that. There are a couple of questions which are very technical questions regarding law, laws related to land and aspects of the constitution. We will direct these questions to Gautam, and we will request him to respond to us in his own time. As of now, the last word to Afreen and to Gautam, if you would like to add anything.
No, I think that's it from me. I mean, yeah, nothing further.
Yeah, just two things. I do agree that there are, like, a lot of similarities between what's happening in India, especially in relation to Kashmir, and what's happening in Palestine. The only reason I said that we should not compare the sufferings as of now, because Kashmir is right now actively suffering a genocide, is being made to brave a genocide. That's the only reason why I said that I would not want to compare at this point of time. Apart from that, I think when it comes to I do agree that there is an indiscriminate aspect to demolitions when it comes to, when you see demolitions as a whole, because most of the time it's the it's it's uh, it's economically weaker sections that are targeted. Most of the times it's slums that are cleared. Most of the times it's laborers who migrant laborers who have now settled and looking for work in big cities like Mumbai and Delhi, whose places of residence that are cleared. And when it comes to punitive demolitions, or when it comes to demolitions of Muslim homes, there of course, that is when the angle of religion comes into place. That is when the angle of Islamophobia comes into place. That is when it is purely motivated by bias and prejudice and hate against this community. And that is why I said, we need to sort of also talk about judicially sanctioned demolitions, because there is a sense of hate against the poor, and irrespective of what background they come from. For example, most of the time it is that Dalits, Muslims who reside in these pockets because they're not allowed housing anywhere else. So that's one. Another thing is that when it comes to demolition of Muslim homes, it's not just like, that the justification of just illegal construction, and that's why it deserves to be demolished. If you go on social media and the kind of discourse that is around demolition of Muslims' homes, it's also that तो पत्थर उठाओगे तो घर तो टूटेगा ही ना, अगर हर Friday के बाद Saturday भी आता है. So that kind of discourse also is around demolitions of Muslims' homes. So there is a very slight thin line difference between the demolition of these two kinds of demolitions. And yeah, of course, the reason why people are not really coming forward, I mean, at least from my personal experience, is that there is a fear that has been instilled that our home might also be demolished. At least in Allahabad, that's what I witnessed. Even like, when my father was granted bail and we tried to file for sureties, one of the persons who agreed to be his surety was intimidated by a police officer in police station in front of me and my younger sister, saying that you do know that his house was demolished and you also have a house, like, sort of linking that there might be repercussions if you support this family. So that fear is there, and of course the crackdown against dissent is a big thing. That's why, like, most organic movements, the only way for communities to be able to resist is if this resistance comes organically, and not if, like, if I as an activist or someone else as a leader of, like, housing rights or whatever comes and says that no, we should resist against it. It has to be an organic movement, and like Gautam sir said, we have to wait for it to get worse for it to get better.
All your points completely well taken, Afreen, and let me just also clarify. See, the whole point of the ILAJ intervention and the webinar is to emphasize on the specific nature of the targeting of Muslim homes, where we have, in our suggestions to the court, we have demanded that communal punitive domicile needs to be recognized as a specific form of bulldozing within the larger set of demolition. So I completely endorse that. I was just trying to draw some larger connections. On Palestine, I mean, when I said that I don't want to compare as yet, that phrase as yet is with a lot of fear. I said that because I don't want things to get to that point. And for that, we are constantly, the effort is to try and intervene now before it is too late. So there's no comparison of what's happening there with what's happening here right now, but we need to intervene proactively now, before hopefully things get better and do not get worse. Okay, so we shall end with that. Thank you very much, both Gautam and Afreen, for participating. And I hope this is part of a larger effort. As Afreen said, something more organically emerges against Bulldozer Raj on the whole, and against its various specificities. From ILAJ, we will continue to raise this issue, and let's see where this takes us. Thank you to all the participants who came and put in their suggestions and asked questions, and all those who came to listen. This listening, I am sure of many people. I mean, there are 28 people still in the meeting as we have reached the final stage. I'm sure this listening will go a long way in raising our consciousness to be able to stand up to this brutal and unconstitutional. I mean, I can go on and on using negative words for another half an hour about this Bulldozer Raj. On that note, thank you very much. Jai Bhim, Lal Salam, and solidarity to our struggling brothers and sisters in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in various parts of India and South Asia. Thank you, and Inkilab Zindabad.